Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis. We are on page 1174. If you need the actual page where we're going to be reading in the Hebrew original, go to ayinbeis.com, and there you have the PDFs of each of these pages. So I also welcome any of the new participants. Just to give a little housekeeping, so this program is every 9:30 every morning. Zoom and the YouTube are available. And there's also a WhatsApp group. So if you're not part of the group, just send us your number and name. I will include you in the group where we have updates if there's any schedule changes. And of course, every day the audio is uploaded there, in addition to the Zoom and the YouTube. The Zoom is live, the YouTube is live as well, but then the YouTube is saved. You could always watch it on YouTube. And the main website for all information around Ayin Beis is chassidusapply.com or ayinbeis.com. They both work. And you could actually see there all the chapters from the beginning, chapter 1. Obviously, it stops at some point around chapter 145 with summaries and so on. I'm saying this for everybody's benefit. And full of resources around Ayin Beis and so on. Ayin Beis is, of course, short for 72, which refers to the Hebrew year 5672, which corresponded with 1912, when this series of discourses was delivered. 1912, that's when we began approximately then studying at the centennial, 2012. And here we are now in 2021, 9 years later. And that's why we're so deep into it. After 9 years, we've reached 1,174 pages. There's at least another 400 pages to go. This volume will be concluded soon, and then we go to volume 3. So, little context, especially those that are joining. I know there's some new participants. So, a little context, and then we'll just continue from where we're up to. The story of Ayin Beis is the story of an interface. An interface, which is really the essence of all relationships, are based on an interface. Two people, for example, have different thoughts, different ideas, different perspectives, different personalities. So how do they communicate with each other? What do they do when there's a disagreement? What do they do when they're not relating to one another? So an interface is what is the secret and key to every relationship. That there's a place where two people meet. Doesn't necessarily mean compromise. Doesn't even mean negotiate. It means that a place, the third dimension that includes and encompasses the perspective of each one of them and has ways of finding ways to connect the two. Every conversation is that way. If we didn't have the ability to interface, we wouldn't be able to have conversations. Now, when there's a conflict, so then you may need to negotiate, you may need to find common ground and so on. So the same thing is in our relationship with the divine. Since the divine is completely beyond us, not just transcendent, but completely beyond, so the mystics, the Kabbalists, and Hasidic thought, which Ayin Beis is a compendium, and more than a compendium, it's like a magnum opus that gathers together all Kabbalistic and Hasidic insights, or I would say more than insights, a blueprint for these interfaces of how we connect with states of consciousness that are higher than us, all the way to the ultimate reality, which is what's called the God. The words of Ayin Beis called the Yesh Amiti, in this context of what we're learning now. The true and absolute reality, how we, in a created reality of existence, connects to that highest place. And the interface is called Ayin. Ayin is a state, can mean and many things. Ayin literally means nothingness, but here it means a state of utter Bittul, which means a state of total nullification or total sublimation. I saw a mimer from the Frierdiker Rebbe where he translates Bittul as Übergegebenkeit, meaning total devotion. It's an interesting word. I've never really used it that way, but the Frierdiker Rebbe says Bittul is Übergegebenkeit, total devotion. Do you want to know where it is? I just saw it the other day, so I just looked it up. Let me just share with you. Give me a second here. It says Übergegebenkeit. Very interesting. Yeah. Übergegeben. And he says, Koyach ma of Chachma, the craft von Übergebenkeit, the art of devotion. Very interesting expression, right? So here we are. So the in-between is this Ayin. This Ayin, I call it a field of energy, a channel, if you wish. Basically, a channel that connects back and forth from the top down and from the bottom up, meaning the ultimate reality with our reality. And essentially, all of life is a journey along this channel, along this ladder. And Ayin is another word that he uses for Oir, because Oir is a reflection of, an expression of the divine, but in Ayin itself, two levels. One that represents, remember interface, so it represents the divine. It's a reflection of the divine in its purest form. And then there's the divine as it relates to existence. So that like represents the other end of the relationship. And these two ayins obviously have many levels, each one of them, as we've discussed at length. And essentially, as I said, our journey, our work is climbing step by step until we get to the deepest type of relationship and connection between these two realities. Okay, so that's just a short summary of just the last, I would say, 20 pages. But that all follows this discussion of interface throughout these 1,174 pages, which discusses different parts of this map, this cosmic map, all the way from the highest levels to the lowest levels. So basically, studying Ayin Beis, you're studying what's the word I want to say? Like an encyclopedic, almost an encyclopedic collection with plenty of his own explanation of all the different stages of this process, from the different discourses of the Chabad Hasidic Rebbes, and even from Kabbalah preceding them, including Kabbalah that preceding them. So where are we now? Let's move from the macrocosm to the microcosm, meaning from the big picture to where we are immediately here. So in the last pages, we've been discussing where these two states of Ayin, where are they located, so to speak. And we know they're located in different areas. Again, this is not physical space, it's conceptual space, different stages of this process. We're discussing right now primarily is what is called the Kav. The Kav is the divine energy that follows the great Tzimtzum. The great Tzimtzum is the concealment that first allowed for an independent consciousness to emerge. And the Kav is the communication between the higher consciousness and the lower consciousness. Preceding the Kav and preceding the Tzimtzum, we discussed there are a bunch of levels as well, and primarily two levels. There's the divine as it begins to envision existence, that he called, to use the Hebrew words, he called machshava da'ano emlech, the thought that I shall rule, which means that there'll be a relationship between a king and a nation. So even though the king is, of course, superior, the divine reality is higher than the nation, which is the creation, which is a separate entity. However, there's still some relationship. Then there's a level where fundamental state of being completely beyond anything, not in relation to something else. The essence of the energy, what he calls isnasus atzmis, that is beyond, and you need to have. So how do you get from the beyond of the beyond to get to a state where the divine is already relating and thinking about, which he also called, so the answer is a prayer that we say, based on a verse that we say every day, Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkaimei. Blessed comes from the word to draw down, Kvod Hashem, the divine glory, meaning the divine king as he relates to the Am, to the people, to existence. From where? Mimkaimei, from its source, in that divine dimension that's beyond existence altogether. So that's the Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkaimei. He also explained that's what means another powerful statement in Pirkei Rabbi Elazar, that till the world was created, meaning till existence began. So he interprets that till that thought of Malchus of Ein Sof, what we call Tehirei Elah, that envisioned, that thought about, and then envisioned existence. Before that was Hayahu, was he and his name alone. So here he didn't describe who. Earlier in the page, top of page 1171, he said who is the level of the etzema air. That is even beyond Shmai, meaning the essential air, but it's not even yet defined even as a reflection, because all it is, if you remember the higher levels of Bittul, of Ayin, all it is an expression of the divine source. Shmai, he says, is the level of Isnasus Atzmis. Shmai ha'atzmi. So though he doesn't spell it out, it's pretty clear here that Shmai does not mean as it relates to another, but it means as it relates to being a state of Isnasus, a state of exalted state, but not yet in relation with something. And from there, you draw down, Baruch Kved Hashem Mekayme, that's Mekayme, the source. From there, you draw down into the state of Malchus, which relates to existence. And the expression, Heidei v'zivoi shel Shmai, so there we have it. So there we have Shmai. From there comes a reflection of that, is the thought and relationship with existence. And from there comes then the tzimtzum, and after the tzimtzum, the kav, and the kav is therefore a reflection of a reflection, which draws from the source, from Shmai, or what he calls Snasus Atzmus. But from a of Malchus Avein, so if you come to after the tzimtzum in the kav. And that's why the kav, and we're talking about the external dimension of the kav, as it relates to shaping, like the paintbrush we talked about, the divine stylus paintbrush. The outer dimension, therefore, is called the Ayin of the Yesh, because this kav, which originates from a state where even before the tzimtzum is already relating to some extent to existence, therefore it's called the Ayin of the Yesh, means the divine energy that relates to and associates and engages with the creation, with the Yesh of the creation. From the beginning of the Kaab, from the beginning of Ishtalshlus, Odam the Bria de Klolos, which is the macrocosmic world of creation, another name for it is Ak, all the way going down, Ishtalshul, from level to level, it descends, it evolves downward, till the end, Seif Maisa, Malchus of Atzilus, in the microcosm of Atzilus, which creates the lower worlds all the way to our existence. That's where we stopped on page 1174. 8 lines from the top. I'm going to continue now with the parentheses. V'hainu. Now this means commission is bar le'il dibra maskal achasha alti. So the Rebbe Rashab is referring to a discourse, earlier discourse called achasha alti. And he's saying, what did we learn there? The tchilas ha'yiserusi liyas seif maisa. So every Friday night we say in the Chadaydi, we say seif maisa machshavat chila. The end of the action, the end of the process, arises b'machshavat chila, the beginning of the thought. In other words, let's say a person is thinking, wants to build a home. So you always think of the end in mind. You don't begin with the first steps. You say, I want a home. And you envision in your machshavat chila, in your earliest stages of your thought, you're conceiving and envisioning what? The end of the product, the end product. Then begins the process, how am I going to get there? So you hire a contractor, and then you hire an architect, a contractor, you have to get materials, you got to get a team, you start building it. So there's a whole process of the building process. But Seif Maisa, the end, what are you intending? You're not interested in the in-between stages, it's only get to the end, to Seif Maisa, to the end of the creation process. So the beginning of the thought and the end are wedged and connected to one another. So he's saying that's what we learned there. That Seif Maisa, the Tchilas Eseres Elias Seif Maisa, that the beginning of the stimulation, when you're first stimulated, your mind was first stimulated with the idea, like in this case, the Machshava V'ano Emlech. When the first thought arose, right before the Tzimtzum, we're talking about the lower level of Malchus of Ein Sof, which arose a thought. What was the thought? It wasn't to have a Ak or a Kav or Atzilus. It was the end was in mind. The rest is a process to get there. So everything obviously is envisioned on that level. But he says the machshava danemlech gam came b'chinas shaychus ala elemus. Who the machshava danemlech gam came b'chinas shaychus ala elemus. So that means, that explains, why is it relating to existence? Why don't you just say that God thought of creation and he didn't think about the whole process and relates to existence. He began the process. It starts step by step because the whole purpose of that thought is to have an existence, not just the earlier, higher levels of that existence, the more spiritual realms or the more sublime realms. That's what he's saying here. So that's why the Chassidus, that's the machshava anel, already has a relationship to the worlds, to the end of the process. And from that thought transfers that intention, which means the creation, all the way to the end of the creation, to the end of the process, begili hakav. So that thought, it translates into the paintbrush, so to speak, into the instrument that God uses to create, the kav, in order to bring existence into actuality. What he's adding in this parenthesis, if you go back to that discourse, I don't want to elaborate so much because it's relevant, but it may also be distracting. What he talks there about a lot is the idea, if I recall correctly, the difference in not safe and b'tchilasan and safe ma'aseh machshava b'tchila. Let me just look for a second to refresh myself. The page is, if you're interested in finding that mimer, it's in approximately 11, it starts in 11:15. So just give me a moment. Actually, 11:17 is where this topic begins. Bottom of 11. Okay, as I said, it's a little more complicated. I have to look up to see what we can take from there that adds to here. But he definitely refers to that. And there he talks about, in other words, how early on does existence begin to be thought of, so to speak, how deep into the divine essential consciousness, pre-tzimtzum, which means we're still completely beyond existence. Where does existence begin to take hold, is maybe a way of putting it. All in the divine consciousness. So what we've established, it's all the way into Tchilas HaMachshava. Okay. Okay, now we continue. Unless somebody has a question, I will continue now after the parentheses. Okay. V'kol zeh hu b'chinas chitzenius hakav. All this is the outer dimension of the kav. And just to refresh, let's go back to our analogy. You have an artist who, before he's even an artist, he's an entity that's beyond being an artist. This is all an analogy. Then he manifests as an artist, which is a particular form of definition of what he's capable of. Not all of it, one aspect, he's an artist. Artist is still a long way from creating art. This artist in turn now has a whole series of steps where he thinks about creating art and what kind of art and so on. Meanwhile, I'm sorry, not even what kind of art, whether to create art, and then he decides, yes, I'm going to now create art. But he has infinite possibilities. It can go many directions. He can paint anything he wants to paint. Then among that, he chooses one. He chooses one type of art, in this case, the 10 hidden spheres. He chooses, but that's still in a state where you could say it's not yet shaped or formed, meaning he doesn't know the specifics. It's just 10 hidden spheres. It's got a general picture. And that in turn slowly turns into the next step where he's getting closer to the actual picture. He starts envisioning the details. And now he's ready to begin, which has to go through now another state called a tzimtzum. He's envisioned the details. That's that like Malchus of Ein Sof. But now he has to begin to do it. He has to now essentially repress and cause all his brilliance and all the options and everything that was preceded to recede backwards, so to speak, recede within himself. And the tzimtzum conceals everything. And then comes a kav. A kav is him taking his fingers with a paintbrush and he's beginning to paint according to the plan that he envisioned. So this would be the example for the kav. Obviously, the analogy is not a perfect one because in God's case, the paintbrush is not a foreign entity. It's an extension of divine energy, but it's a good example because now the divine energy is focused on creating this art and not another piece of art with a particular structure, chachma, bina, das. This is the structure that will define all of existence. But the process of bringing it into place is the kav. So when you think about it, the kav itself has two dimensions. One is the art of actually shaping and defining details in the piece of art. If the artist is all consumed with his vision, he won't get the details right. So part of it has to be a very focused, laser, sharp focus on the structure. What does he want on this canvas? The details specifically. But that's the outer dimension, but that's the implementation. But that is being informed by the energy, so to speak, that defines what he wants to convey in this art. Like writing a book. Yes, you have to be precise what words you want to use, but you also want to make sure that the content and the spirit of what you're conveying is not compromised and it's intact. You know, you can find someone who has great words, but then you start saying, what's he saying? The idea can get lost in many words. Or the opposite, you may have too few words. So it has to be a perfect balance between the implementation and the driving force that's driving that implementation. So the Pnimius HaKav, you can say, is carrying the deeper feelings and sentiments and spirit of what the artist initially envisioned. Not just envisioning the structure of the art, but what's the message he wants to convey through that structure. So Chitzenius HaKav is clearly relates to the structure. That's his purpose. But we're going to move now to Pnimius HaKav. Now remember, a few pages back when the whole discussion was coming to explain how the Chitzeni is the outer dimension of this Kav, is rooted in Malchus of Ein Sof, which means it relates more to existence. Malchus of Ein Sof is the thought. Remember the thought? Just 1 second. The thought that is relating to kingship, which means relating to another. And the Pnimius of the Kav is rooted in Tiferes Hanelam, which is a much higher level. We'll soon discuss what level that is right now, soon. That is much more about the source itself. In the example of the artist, the paintbrush, as it defines its details, is rooted in the details in his thought. And the inner dimension of that paintbrush, so to speak, that conveys and captures the spirit, that preserves the spirit of the message, that's rooted deeper inside of him, not in the details, but in the intention. What does he want in the first place? Which is higher than just relating to those details. So essentially, the two levels of the Kav are rooted in two levels before the Tzimtzum, which are, one relates to existence and one is beyond existence, what he called the Snasus Atzmis and Snasus Ala'am. So, but now we just covered the Chitzenius HaKav. So Kol Zeh is the outer dimension. Shezeu ma shenimshach me'ed ein sof l'hoyres ha'elemus. That outer dimension of this Kav, of this ray and line and thin ray and thread of light, is where does it originate from? That's rooted, it's being drawn from Eid Ein Sof that radiates in the worlds. That means it's prepared to radiate and relate to existence. with an energy and a vitality that is commensurate to the worlds, with measure and parameter, or measure and parameter, structure. Which this means in this defined light does not, it means in this does not radiate. Here the focus is not how the world's existence is completely nullified in comparison to its source, because that's the opposite of the purpose. If the paintbrush, the artist, as he's painting the detail, starts focusing on the source, he'll lose sight of the structure. So this energy in it does not radiate how the worlds are kala chashiv, that they're nullified, kala, as if nothing, as if they don't exist, meaning the ayin of the yesh amiti. Kim adarab, but rather on the contrary, she'ilm is tev simokim. This energy absolutely recognizes and relates to existence. The existence has some value here. So even though he's the melech and the king, but he's relating to the people, to the nation, and they have value. That's why we said before, Berev Am Hadas Melech, that when you have a large multitude of people, it adds in the honor of the king. The higher level of Malchus doesn't need anything. Nothing adds to it. He's fundamentally in a state of a superior state. Not superior to anything, he's just a unique reality, a unique and total absolute reality, reflective obviously of Atmos itself. Here, however, we're talking already how the king has become relating to a nation. So yes, he's above them, but you can't say that they're completely nullified, because on the contrary, he's relating to them and they have value to the point that he has his snasus aleim. He has like a leadership over them. He's their leader and he's exalted above them. Interesting expression, both potentially and actually. I think what that would mean, bekoyach may mean the way it's before the tzimtzum, and bepoel is after the tzimtzum, I would assume. No, it's bekoyach when he's amachshava emloich. That's when he's thinking about it. But there's no nation yet. There's no existence. So there's the potential of existence, but he's relating to it within himself. It's like the king right before he comes out to his multitudes, to his subjects. So he's still not with them, but he's preparing, he's relating to them. And then the Bepoel is when he actually becomes a Melech, when there is an actual existence, like every Rosh Hashanah. The first Rosh Hashanah, God had to, so to speak, or stimulated himself. But every Rosh Hashanah, there is Bepoel, a Melech and a... That's one way you can explain. There may be another way. I don't want to go there because it may confuse matters, but that's the simplest way of interpreting it. So that's Chetzenius HaKav. Okay? So basically the Kav part is the implementation. The Malchus of Ein Sof is the root of where that implementation came from. So like we said earlier, that God envisioned, remember he envisioned Goliv Galifu, not just he envisioned the concealed worlds, the hidden worlds and the revealed worlds, thought and speech. So even the speech that would emerge from him, he also envisioned. So all this transfers over then to the Kav after the Tzimtzum to implement. To put it in even more specific terms, that if the artist did not envision the details beforehand, when he starts painting, he may make mistakes. Just like when you have, let's say, an architect who lays out a blueprint for a structure, everything is in the blueprint. If he misses one detail in the blueprint, the contractors and the builders can't build. So even though it's still in a blueprint stage, but the detail is there. So machshava v'noemlech, if you remember the language he used, kol mashiyil achra tzimtzum. Everything that will be after the tzimtzum is there, but it's in a blueprint form. Not even a blueprint. There it's more in the God's thought. But it's all there. And that will inform the outer dimension of the Kav, how to shape each detailed sphere, Chochmah, Bina, and so on. Now he moves to Primis Hakav. What about the inner dimension that's informing the outer dimension of this stylus, of this example I'm using, paintbrush? Now remember, this applies to art, this applies to any conception of an idea, from concept to actual. All this can apply. Okay. However, the dimension of the inner dimension of the kav, which like we said, is not about details. It's about the integrity, it's about the spirit of the whole message and everything this art is meant to convey. Primis hakav, hu shenimshach mebchinas primis va'atzmos ein sof. This does not originate in the envisioning of the details of Malchus of Ein Sof, what he called the Ha'ara, Kvoid Hashem, Malchus that relates to Hisnasus Ala'am, that level. The level of Tehiri Allah, Golif Galifu B'Tehiri Allah. It's not there. This is rooted in Primius Atzmus Ein Sof. Now this is not Atzmus, is the Primius and Atzmus of Ein Sof is what he means here. Okay, so now he suddenly goes to higher than Koyach HaMachshava. You would have thought, based on the flow that we learned here, the Chetzenius HaKav, the outer dimension of the Kav, relates to Machshava, of Ano Emlech, the Machshava that I will rule and have a relationship with another, within the divine consciousness, yes. And then Primius HaKav, Tiferes HaNelam, goes to Koyach HaMachshava, Mekeme, Baruch Kvoid Hashem Mekeme. The source is Nasus Atzmis. He says right here, even higher than Koyach HaMachshava. So very clear, he's going right higher than the higher level. So we have now a third level that's higher than Koyach HaMachshava. We'll discuss, but let's first read what he says, and then we'll discuss what exactly is he referring to. And why, what compels the Rebbe Rashab to go that high? Why can't you just say Tiferes HaNelam is, I'm going back to where he first discussed it on page 1170. He said, let me go here. He says, yeah, there he also says, and Tiferes goes to Keser. So it could be because Tiferes goes up to Keser, so Tiferes HaNelam may be the level of Koyach HaMachshava. And Primis Atzmis Ein Sof may be even higher than that. Let's read, and then we'll try to define it as closely as possible. But he clearly says, L'mayla Mekayach HaMachshava. In other words, even more than the state of potential, where he's potentially the hiyuli, the potential state where all thoughts come from. Like you said at the top of page 1173. So he goes like this. Shaligaba Atzmus, and this level where the Primius Hakav originates from, which is the inner core dimension of Ein Sof, he says, compared to Atzmus, Hariyakol Eino Tefes Malkum Klal. Here, nothing, everything is nullified. Nothing has value on this level. V'kula kamei k'lo chashiv mamish. And everything, kamei, before him, is k'lo chashiv, is like completely non-existent. Has no value. Its value is like nothing. Mamish, literally. As opposed to Chetzenius Hakav, which is rooted from Machshava Naim. Like there you can't say that it's non-existent, because the whole purpose there, he wants to relate to existence. So that means it has something that he wants. We're not getting whether he needs to. We're talking about, but he's relating. Here, on this level, what resonates, what shines on this level is that everything is nullified. That type of experience. Not about structure, but about all of it being completely, so to speak, completely in awe or nullified and sublimated by the divine source. So essentially, the Primius Hakav in this context is conveying and carrying that message. That's the structure, the whole purpose of the structure of existence is not to be an end in itself. The art was not to be an end. It was to be a dira lo yizbara b'tachteirim. that this world, this existence, included, which is built by the 10 spheres, the building blocks, Chachma, Bina, Das, Chesed, Gvura, Tiferes, Netzach, Yesod, Malchus. The purpose of it, it should be a home and a dwelling place, a mishkan for the divine essence. So if you only had Chitzeni Sakav, you'd have a structure, a beautiful structure, all aligned exactly how God wanted it to be. But at the end of the day, it's a structure. Where's the purpose of the structure? That Pnimi Sakav carries that from all the way from the deeper levels, that the purpose of all this is to become a structure of the divine, completely a channel of divine energy. Now, obviously, if you only had the Pnimi Sakav, you don't have existence. If you only have existence, you don't have the purpose. That's why you need both. You need the defined structure, but you also needed to know and embedded within it that the purpose of it is to become elevated, all the way to the point of recognizing that it's all part of the divine essence. It doesn't spell this out here, but I'm using language from earlier to discuss this. So I see he's not going to say more about this level, maybe. Let me just see something. Yes, he actually does say more to the end of this page. So I'm not going to elaborate now about why it's higher than Koyach HaMachshava, but he clearly says it. And it makes sense. Because at the end of the day, even Isnasus Atzmis, even that level that we learned, where essentially the oyer that reflects the fact that God is a unique reality, not because he's greater than something else. He's just great in his own personality, just totally within himself, a different type of reality. That too is a level, because you call it Hisnasus Atzmis, like I mentioned yesterday. Even to say that God is so beyond us, that has no relationship at all with us, is also a statement. Because if you really talk about the highest level of Atzmus, you don't have to say anything. You don't say he's beyond, you don't say he's not beyond, you don't say he's beyond being beyond. It is what it is. So the mere fact that you're saying it's so beyond that he has an inner chamber where he's there, that he's not connected to anyone, that's also a statement. That's also, I don't want to call it a limitation, but it's definitely a definition. Like it's similar to what the Avedus HaKodesh says, Ibn Gabbai, Meir Ibn Gabbai says, talks about that Kishem should, just as God has the power to create the infinite, he has the power to create the finite. And he says why? Because if you say he doesn't have the power to create the finite, that itself makes him finite. That itself is limiting. That he could only be infinite. He cannot create the finite. And he says, what's the first level of finite? The 10 spheres. Basically, the infinite would be like the level, Eir HaBligvul would be higher than Ano Emlech. Ano Emlech is envisioning the Eir HaGvul, so to speak. The energy that is all coming from the infinite, but the infinite is now defining itself in one piece of art. But based on that statement, you can go even further. That not only is he not limited to the infinite or to the finite, he's also not limited by saying infinite and finite. That's also a statement. So in truth, to say that God relates to existence, to say that God does not relate to existence are two levels. So even the higher level is also not the beginning of the process. So the Pnimi Sakav is saying is not only the root of the thought, Koyach HaMachshava, which we called Hisnasus Atzmis before. Baruch Kvod Hashem Imkemesh, Shmoi. But it's also who. That's what it looks like he's referring to. Because remember who, Shmoi was Hisnasus Atzmis. Who is higher than that? So it seems that that's clearly saying that higher level, but I just give a little explanation. Because at the end of the day, we don't just want the godliness that relates to existence. We don't even want the godliness that doesn't relate to existence. We want a godliness that relates and doesn't relate, and both of them are equal all the way to the highest levels, if you can put it that way. So ultimately, to put it in simpler terms, I'll use an example from Basi Ligani, the mimer that is being learned this year, chapter 11 in Basi Ligani, and the Rebbe's mimer in 1961, where he brings the Torah of the Maggid. It's a very interesting piece in this mimer. It relates mamish to this. There's an expression, we know Havaya Adnai, we learned it as well earlier. And so it probably relates here actually, based on Havaya Adnai. So the word Havaya, it says, so we learned this, Hashem Echad, V'Shmei Echad, Hashem Kadosh, V'Shmei Kadosh. Now the name of God, the tetragrammaton, the Shem HaMeferish, Yud Kei Vav Kei, we don't pronounce it. We're not allowed to pronounce it. We don't know how to pronounce it. It was only once a year during the time of the temple, when the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would go into the Holy of Holies, so he knew the secret of pronouncing the Yud Kei Vav Kei. How do we pronounce it when we say it? Every time we say Baruch Atah Hashem, so we pronounce it Adnai. I just changed the way we express it because I don't want to say the word the way we're supposed to say it. But we don't read Yud Kei Vav Kei, Yud Hey Vav Hey. We don't read it that way at all. No one ever uses that. We read it Adnai. Baruch Atah Hashem. Baruch Atah. I say Hashem, but Hashem just means name. Adnai. So the Gemara says, why? Because today, Loi kashani nichtev kachani nikra. The way it's written is not the way it's read. The Kohen Gadol read it the way it's the way it's written is not the way. No, the way it's written, that's the way it's pronounced. Not read, pronounced. Or read. The Kohen Gadol is kishem shu nichtev kachu nikra. The way it's written, that's the way he pronounced it. So it's like a line. So the Maggid asks why. So he explains, because Shem Havaya, why is it the Shem HaMeferish? Because it's the Shem HaEtzem. It's the name that is closest to reflect the divine essence. And that, on its own, is beyond existence. When we pronounce something, we're revealing it. So on paper, when it's written, it's not being revealed. So it's written that way, Yud Kei Vav Kei. But today, in Golus, and not in the Beis HaMikdash and Yom Kippur, we have to pronounce it, Begilui, it has to be B'tzimtzum. So the way it emerges is Adnai, because Adnai is Havaya, so to speak, after the Tzimtzum. Like he says there, Nagid Shema, Ovid Shema. In order to express the name, you have to conceal the name, lose the name. The Rebbe explains that's the Tzimtzum. So basically, the Tzimtzum is necessary because if you revealed Havaya, existence would become completely nullified. Like we're learning here, because it's a higher dimension. What happens on Yom Kippur? So the Maggid says on Yom Kippur, because the Kohen Gadol, who's the holiest, on the holiest day, goes into the holiest location, Zman Elam Shana Nefesh, in time, in space, and in person, the soul is the holiest. And he's removing himself from Gashmis Ha'elam, because we know 7 days before Yom Kippur, he separates himself and prepares himself. Hafshatas HaGashmis, he calls, removing of the Gashmis, and goes into a very spiritual state. Since he goes into a spiritual state, so now he can pronounce and reveal Havaya, because he himself is no longer in that Gashmisdika place, which needs the Tzimtzum. That's the Maggid. The Rebbe asks a question, 1 second. Since when is a spiritual state closer to the energy before the Tzimtzum than a physical state? It's true. It makes you more transcendent, more spiritual. But why is that closer to Havaya? Havaya is still before the Tzimtzum, and Ruchnis and Gashmis both would be nullified if Havaya was revealed. So just because he became more refined, yes, he's able to reach higher levels. But Havaya, we're talking about a level that is beyond everything. So the Rebbe answers that that's why he says Shema Etzem. The fact that he becomes more spiritual is not the main reason why he's able to pronounce Havaya. It's because he reaches a state that's beyond spiritual and beyond material. In other words, to put it simply, many people aspire to getting a transcendent experience. And to do so, you have to either fast or you have to be what's the word I want to use? Where you separate yourself, asceticism. You separate yourself from the world. You go up to a mountain, you meditate, mindfulness. You need space. Why? Because the physical world is a distraction and you need to focus on something transcendent. Basically, you're moving from the body to the soul. This is the essence of all spiritual systems, creating space so you can go into a more spiritual state. So many people think that's Yom Kippur. You're going to a more spiritual state. But we know that godliness is not closer to spiritual than he is to material. Spirituality is maybe more conducive, but you could also be a very spiritual, arrogant person. You could be a spiritual person that has all kinds of your own stuff. Because spirituality is not utter bittul. Spirituality is superior to physicality in the sense that it's more sublime, more transcendent. But it doesn't mean it's closer to Atzmos. The Rebbe once wrote in a letter to a conference on Jewish mysticism in London. Interesting statement. He says the key difference between Jewish mysticism and other schools of mysticism is that in Jewish mysticism you can reach higher through an action than through a meditation. Meditation takes you away from the world of action. So it has its power, contemplation, hisbonenus. But the ultimate is coming to a place that's beyond the spiritual, a place that, as he says there in the Maimer, in Basiligani, 1961, a place nimna hanimnois, that you are in the physical world, at the same time you are able to be beyond it. So that's where the Kohen Gadol reached. That's why he could say the Shem Havaya, because he actually reaches a place that's beyond material and beyond. But in other words, transcendence itself is not the ultimate purpose. It's to get to a place that's beyond transcendence, where being immersed, immanence and transcendence can be joined as one, as the Rebbe brings there. That's why the Kohen Gadol has to be married. The Kohen Gadol goes back, Lebeisei, Isha Beisei, goes back after the Kodesh Kodashim. It says he goes back home. Why do we have to know he's going back home? Because you need to know he's grounded in existence. He didn't just go on a spiritual high and unrelated to existence. The Nadav Avihu did do that. They got burned out. That was not the kavanah. The four that went into the paradise, into the orchard, three of them, one died, one went mad, one became an apostate. Only Rabbi Akiva nichnas b'shalom v'yatsa b'shalom. Because the real accomplishment of connecting to God is not that you know how to reach high states of consciousness, is that you can reach high states of consciousness and fuse it with existence in this world. And that's why Yom Kippur, even though it's Achaz Bashana, but it's still Bashana. It's one day in the year, but it connects to all the other days of the year. It's not you're going out of time. You're not going out of time and space. There's a Beis HaMikdash. There's a Kodesh Kodashim. But the Kodesh Kodashim are in Mokem Ha'aron Eina Min Hamida. The space is there, but the space itself, it reflects something beyond space. It doesn't say you just went beyond space. If Yom Kippur was a day where we leave time and space and we leave all of existence for a day, that's one thing, but that's not the intention. So therefore, in Nimna Nimnois, like I spoke the other day about Basiligani, a love of the Alter Rebbe's interpretation, that you have to bring both together. That's why the Alter Rebbe, the famous story, on Yom Kippur, in the middle of Yom Kippur, he took off his talis and went to help a widow who was in need. On Yom Kippur, how could he do such a thing? Yom Kippur, you're in Kodesh Kodashim, a Rebbe. Someone else couldn't go. Because that's the Chiddush. He's not defined by his spirituality. No matter what kind of high level he was able to have the composure and the presence to go help another person. If you are so spiritual and you forget that there's another person, it means you're stuck on a level. Yes, it's a nice transcendent level. The Mittler Rebbe was learning and a child was crying. The Alter Rebbe was on upstairs. The Mittler Rebbe was they were living in the same house, same building, but different floors. A baby was crying, fell out of the crib. The Mittler Rebbe was so immersed in his learning, he didn't hear the child. The Alter Rebbe then took the baby out of the crib. Picked up the baby, put it back in the crib. And then he told his son, the Mittler Rebbe, no, something's missing. If you don't hear the cry of a child while you're middle learning, there's something wrong. You could say, 1 second, what a beautiful level. He's come not distracted by anything, not by the telephone, not by a business, not even a child crying. That means that he's on a spiritual level, fine, but you haven't reached the ultimate where you can combine both. So that's what the Rebbe says about Yom Kippur. So you call the name, so he's able to pronounce the name just as it's written, because there's a seamlessness between spirituality and physical. Not just you left the physical and you entered the spiritual. You're able to join the two because you went even to Shema Etzem, a higher level. Now, applying that to here works perfectly. The Kav, Chitzenius HaKav, and Malchus of Ein Sof, that's the structure. I'm not going to say it's the physical, but it's Gvul. Mekemei, Baruch Kved Hashem Mekemei, is transcendence. It's the divine as it's beyond the structure of existence. Hisnasus atzmis. But that's still not the ultimate. The ultimate is really the joining together. Who? Not just Shmoy, which is the mocker of Kved Hashem or Machshav Havana Emlech. That it goes all the way to Primis Atzmis Ein Sof, where there, everything is nullified. Not only Gashmis, not only the structure, but also beyond structure. And that's why they could all join together as one. That obviously is the ultimate will be when Mashiach comes, total fusion between the highest levels and Elam Hazeh. So you have Eirus, Kalim, and you'll have the Etzem, which combines everything, transcendence and immanence on all levels. Obviously today, we human beings, we can't just jump there. You can't just jump into Atzmus and say, hey, great. You have to go through these stages. First, you have to be in an immanent state, that divine that relates to you, Ayin of Yesh HaNivra. Then you come to the Ayin of the Yesh HaMiti, of a divine that relates to, reflects on Etzem, until you experience the Etzem itself, which combines both of them, and all of them can join as one. And we need all the levels. You can't just jump. You need step by step by step, each one of us in our own particular way. So that's what he says. That's how I would explain this whole piece here, in context of the Maimer, but also based on what the Rebbe says in the Basel Gani Chaf Aleph. Okay, we're going to stop here. Anybody have any questions? Any comments? Nothing? Okay, good. So we'll stop here, middle of page 1172. Oops, I'm not hearing.